Yes. All right. Let's hope that's working. Good. Yes, officially afternoon to everyone. It's good to see everybody here, braving the chilly Florida weather, able to come out when it's only 60 degrees and, make it all the way down here for some study. So we have had a great emotional roller coaster in the Torah readings recently, right? We have hit the heights of Sinai. We have hit the details of what we're supposed to be doing, called Mishpatim. So we have the theological highs, and we have the in practice, I don't want to call them lows, but details. And now we hit the part that everybody loves most, the building of the Mishkan. Yay, said the grumbles around the table. All right, so we've talked about this for a few years, and we're going to talk about it again, but we're going to focus on what you might call a tangent. But bear with me. I hope that this will be interesting. There's lots to go over here, and there's going to be a little question right up at the start. So let's go ahead and plunge in. So we're going to start at the beginning of Terumah. So that's page 485, chapter 25, verse 1. And is my erstwhile volunteer continuing to volunteer?
I will continue to volunteer.
I would hate to presume. Okay.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Tell the Israelite people to bring me gifts. You shall accept gifts for me from every person whose heart so moves him. And these are the gifts that you shall accept from them: gold, silver, and copper, blue, purple, and crimson yarns, fine linen, goat's hair, tanned ram skins, dolphin skins, and acacia wood, oil for lighting, spices for the anointing oil and for the aromatic incense, lapis lazuli and other stones for setting, for the ephod and for the breastpiece. And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them. Exactly as I show you the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its furnishings, so shall you make it."
Here is the Mishkan. All right, so the Mishkan is going to be built in order that we will have a portable reminder of the experience of God's presence at Sinai. So when it says that God will dwell among us, notice, however, God is dwelling among us, not in it. Right? The building of the Mishkan is not building a house for God. Right? It doesn't say that God is going to live in the Mishkan. It says that God is going to be among us if we have the Mishkan. And very much that's how it works. If you have a sanctuary, the Mishkan, the preeminent example, but any synagogue since, then you have a place where you are more aware of God's presence. It doesn't actually change the density of God in the surrounding space. Make sense? Very good. And what do we need to build it?
This long list of stuff.
We got God's wish list, right? This is the stuff that God wants us to provide in order that the Mishkan is going to be built. What's that?
Bridal registry.
It's the bridal registry, exactly. Well, the view of us standing with God at Mount Sinai is very often compared to a bride and groom standing together under the chuppah, except ours had a mountain over our head. So bridal registry is a very apt description. God wants to move in, but before he goes into our bachelor pad, we've got to spruce things up a little bit. Curtains, some decorations, things are going to look much, much nicer. Anything in the list stand out to you as being interesting, unusual?
Dolphin skins?
Dolphin skins? Maybe. Commentators go to town on that one.
I bet they do, because they're in the desert and dolphins live in water.
Well, not just that, but because the actual word doesn't say dolphin. Right. It's its own word, and this is the best translation that JPS can come up with. But there are other alternative translations as well, which we're not going to get into today because
that's good to know.
The taxonomy is no fun.
Okay.
However, if you remember, I've mentioned before, great website, Rationalist Judaism, by Rabbi Slifkin, I believe, or Silfkin, who does biblical zoology. The zoo rabbi, as he is colloquially known. Very, very brilliant scholar, and a wonderful contribution. He has a whole zoo museum, biblical Jewish museum in Israel, which someday I hope to be able to visit, where he has artifacts for all the animals that are mentioned in Torah and Talmud that are there. So yes, that he has some interesting pieces on what this animal may actually be. I refer you to him because he's done a lot more research than I have on this animal. Anything else stand out? One word is so obvious that we don't even realize that we don't understand it. Techelet. Blue. We all know what blue is, right?
Yeah.
No, we don't. What is techelet? What is blue?
Isn't that what we use in the tzitzit?
Your tzitzit have blue in them?
No, they don't.
No, they don't.
No.
All right, so indeed, it is the same word that's used in the final paragraph for the Shema and her texts, where we talk about the tzitzit, where we talk about the fringes on our talitot, and it says that there is a patil techelet, that there is a thread of blue that is woven into it. But it says actually techelet, not blue. How do you know techelet's blue? How do you know blue is blue?
Tradition.
Tradition. But you've never seen it. I mean, have you seen this blue?
Well, it's supposed to come from something very special, like a snail in the ocean that there isn't any, or something. You're right, it's very complicated because it can't just be any old blue color that you, like ink.
Or is it actually blue?
Maybe it isn't blue.
But there are those who argue.
The flag got it wrong.
What's that?
Then the flag got
Oh,
it
the
wrong.
Israeli flag.
Well, so let's look at our commentators.
And the other colors do
So,
make sense. It's
We are going to start with what color in and of itself techelet is and why we think it is blue, and why some think it's not. But then we are going to get into the question of the practical use of techelet, because we may not be building a mishkan anymore, but as Judy already pointed out, techelet has a second use for another mitzvah, which is for the tzitzit on our talitot. All right.
But we do under the other colors that are mentioned, purple, crimson. We're not questioning those. Those are
The other colors seem to have more attribution. See, the problem with techelet is we have another word for blue in Hebrew, right? What's the other word for blue? Kahol, right? And when you have two words that are for the same color, and you don't have the color wheel of ancient Israel that you can look exactly at what color they called this one and they called that one, it's hard. Because although we tend to think of colors very scientifically, you all remember that spectrum you had to learn, right? Of the Roy G. Biv, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. That's my fourth grade teacher, Roy G. Biv. That's how we had to remember it. Although we think of that as being a scientific tool, and it is, and we can measure the wavelengths of the color that create that impression in our minds, the borders between colors is a social construct. That is to say, every culture chooses which colors are in which category when we're talking along the edges. And that's going to come back in just a minute, so if you don't understand what I mean by that, just hold on. Okay, so first let's get Rambam's summary, because he's always good to start.
The term techelet, mentioned throughout the Torah, refers to wool dyed blue, the color of the firmament, which appears opposite the sun when there is a clear firmament.
All right, so firmament is the rakia, right?
Sky.
And sky would be a good translation as well, because firmament isn't something we talk about a lot, but I just wanted to emphasize the notion here that when Rambam is talking about the firmament, he is talking about a physical structure that is surrounding our earthly world, and apparently it has a particular hue to it. And that skyish hue of the firmament is the color of techelet when the sun's in just the right place. Because after all, we all know the sky looks different in different parts of the sky and at different times of the day. So everyone now knows exactly what it looks like, right? Not so much. Well, he's gonna give us a few more clues.
If the techelet is not dyed with this dye, it is unfit to be used as tzitzit, even though it is like the firmament in color.
All right, so make sure we got that here. You have to use the right kind of dye to make the techelet, to make the color that's matching the firmament, because even if you use another color that matches it identically, but from a different source, it's not correct. Sounds a little weird.
Yes.
I thought the color was what was important. Now the source is important? If I can have an identical color but an alternative source, does that mean it's invalid? Yes, says Rambam, and we're going to go into the details of why in just a little bit.
Back at that period of time, were they using berries and other fruits to make their dyes?
Among other things. So you had botanical dyes that were made from different types of plants, different parts of the plants, and different ways of processing them. You had animal dyes that were made from various bits and bobs of beasts. Bits and bobs and beasts, including things that were in the land, air, and sea. And you had mineral dyes, dyes that were made from different ores and minerals that were then usually pulverized and mixed together to make the dye. And many of those recipes we still have, and some of them we don't, which is why we're talking about techelet now without being 100% sure what it looks like, as if we still had a dye being made by the same source that created a color that we would recognize as fitting this description, we wouldn't be having this conversation any more than if I say argamon is purple. We have examples of purple that have been consistent throughout the ages, and we can hold up purple and say this is what they meant by purple. I can't hold up a undisputed example of techelet. And that's why we have to look at the clues that our texts have given us if we want to visualize this. Strange. And where it went, we will talk about.
For example, using isatis, indigo, black dye, or other dark dyes is unacceptable for tzitzit.
Well, that's an interesting list, isn't it?
Yeah, has nothing to do with blue.
Yeah. So, isatis? I actually even looked up how to pronounce this word. Woad, by the way, is the colloquial term. This is a type of plant that is a European version of how you get indigo. It's not considered quite as good as true indigo as far as dyers go, what you learn from Wikipedia. But it is still used. And interestingly enough, the word that's used is exactly the same in Hebrew. So it's that has been the word for at least 1,000 years for this particular plant that creates an indigo color. But black dye and other dark dyes, Rambam seems to think that techelet is a dark color that you might be confused by. Maybe? Any other interpretations?
If you use black dye in a weak form, it's often dark blue or dark green.
So if you dilute the dye so that it doesn't give its full strength, its full saturation, then it could be a bluey hue, more indigo, right? It's that question when you're standing in the dark closet in the early morning and you're looking at your socks. Are these my navy blue socks or are these my black socks? Or is it one of each, which is usually how I end up. But so yeah, in the wrong lighting and the wrong saturation, blue and black can look very, very similar, but no one's going to confuse sky blue for black, are they?
Depends on whether it be the daylight sky.
Yeah.
Okay, so we were sort of interpreting this rakia, this firmament blue, as being sort of the daytime blue, but perhaps what Rambam was thinking, was the color of the firmament when the sun was literally the opposite side, right? So the first view of reading it is sort of like if you have the sun over here, right? What's the color over here, right? And that would be sort of a light to dark light blue. But what if you look at it with the sun here, and we're looking over here? We call that nighttime. All right, that would be midnight blue. So maybe it's somewhere along the spectrum of lightish medium blue to a darker blue that Rambam is trying to uncover for us. Well, let's see if we can find someone else who'll help us. How about a Karaite?
A Karaite.
Do we remember what Karaites are?
Yeah.
All right, so Karaites were a sect that broke off from Judaism around about the 7th and 8th century CE. They rejected rabbinic Judaism. That is to say, they rejected the Talmud, they rejected the Mishnah, they rejected the Midrash. They said, we're going to read the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh just for itself, and that's where we're going to get all our information from. which means they've got to sort of make stuff up to fill in the gaps. And indeed, Yefet, one of the most famous of the Karaite commentators, has to do just that.
Yefet, a Karaite, says that Techelet is a kind of black because all colors end in it. A playlet on Techelet and Tachlit.
Right, so he's taking that sort of semi-pun way, it's called linguistic creativity, puns, to say, well, you know, Techelet, Tachlit, it's an end. Well, what's the end of all colors? Black, right? That's the terminus of all colors. You don't believe me? What happens if you mix orange, so what happens if you mix yellow and red? You get orange, right? What happens if you mix orange and brown? What happens if you mix orange and brown and blue and green, right? And purple. And what's that mishmash going to be called? Black, right? So it is the end of all colors. You add up all the colors from an additive color system, which was the most common in the ancient world, and you're going to get black. So he's got kind of a point, right? What is the king of all colors? Black.
And all return to it, to black. But it can't change with human action.
Right, so imagine you got a big pile of black and you want to mix yellow into it. It won't matter. It's going to be black. It's going to stay black. And so his argument is you can't take black and change it into another color. So it is clearly the ultimate purest terminus, tachlit. It's it. That's the end all and be all of colors. That must be Techelet then.
But we rely on the words of the sages who say it is greenish.
So Ibn Ezra, on the other hand, says, no. But why does Ibn Ezra say he's wrong? Because we have a tradition, right? We have a chain of people who tell us what it looks like that goes back to people who used to see it. And they said it was Yarok. Now, before you run off and say, but wait a minute, green isn't blue. It is kind of. And in fact, in many cultures, the word that's used for green and blue is the same color word. This is when I said a little while ago that color is a very culturally determined system. There are different degrees of color differentiation among different cultures. That's a lot of difference in one sentence, right? So if you go to one culture, they may only have 4 words for different colors. And every color will fit into one of those 4 categories. And if you go to another culture, they may have 8 words for cultures or for colors. And they will divide up their colors into those 8. And others will add in the lights and the darks and the brights and the deep and all of those other adjectives as well. But the color doesn't change, but how you perceive it as belonging to a particular category will change. And blue and green are 2 colors that are often lumped together into one category by many, many cultures as just being a general catch-all for this. So when he says green, that doesn't mean we should think of this as being a bright asparagus. It just means that it falls within a category that covers greenish blues and bluish greens and greeny blue and blue and green green. It's just all the same big lump in his conception.
Well, that almost makes a little bit of sense, because if you have blue and you mix yellow into it, you get green.
Absolutely, right?
So,
they are.
So you can vary it to make, okay.
Right, and if you think back to my Roy G. Biv, right,
Yes.
Green and blue are side by side on the actual visual spectrum. So where you draw the line of overlapping, we in America, we like to make green its own category and blue its own category, but you could just as easily take the ends off of each of them and make that one category, and take the other ends and attach them to the oranges and the indigos on the other side. It's our choice. Right? It's our choice. I hope that's not Penelope telling me this isn't working. It's not. Good. Okay. So our tradition says this is blue. Our tradition is from people who actually did see it way back in the day. And we're going to get 2 more about that, and then we're going to see about what happened to it.
Okay. Techelet resembles the color of the sea, and the sea resembles the sky, and the sky resembles the holy throne.
Okay. Don't know why I put an E there. So from Menachot, from the Talmud, they say Techelet was the same color as the sea, and the sea is the same color as the sky, and the sky is the same color as the holy throne. So you put all those together and you're definitely talking about somewhere in the bluish spectrum. Not that all of us have seen the Holy Throne, but the idea being that the color was meant as a definite reminder of the heavens, that this color in particular should trigger that reaction. And one more thing that we would also help us understand.
The earliest time to recite the bracha is when one can distinguish between one's techelet strands and the white strands of his tzitzit.
So Shulchan Aruch brings back something that's also mentioned by the earlier rabbis, that we do the timing in the morning for the blessing based upon how much light there is. And this is before you could flip a switch. You woke up and the sun was going to be up soon. And so what time were you able to say the blessing and put on your talit? When you could tell the difference between the techelet and the white that were mixed together in the tzitzit and the fringes. Now, if it was black, that would be a very, very dark time still, because the difference between black and white is pretty stark even in the middle of the night. But if it's a lighter color together with the white, then you're probably going to have to wait until the sun's up a little bit more. But Shulchan Aruch never saw techelet in his life. That is to say, Rabbi Joseph Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, or the Ramah for that matter, who wrote the gloss, they never saw techelet, because techelet had not been in use for at least, by their point, about 700 to 800 years. So what happened to techelet? Where did it go? Why can't I just pull up a uncontrovertible example and say, this is techelet, and we could all go to lunch early? Well, if you look in the little box on the side, right, you'll see a timeline here. And this is the timeline of techelet's disappearance. So 100 BCE, Caesar and then Augustus after him limit techelet to only being used by the governing classes. Right? You couldn't just go down to Target and buy techelet. It was under Roman rule limited to only certain people, because it was a special color. It was a distinctive color. And as I look around the table, I'm very quickly reminded how colorful we are now and how spoiled we are by choice of color. Go back 2,000 years, and this would have been a king's ransom worth of color in one place. And techelet was something that was prized and kept special by the emperors because, well, they could. And Nero goes further and says not just ruler classes, but only the emperors can wear the purple and the blue. When we get along a little bit further on, 383, there's still restrictions. And in fact, it's considered now a state monopoly. But not only can you not buy it, you can't even make it. Only the state businesses that are set up in order to produce this color can make it. Getting rough, yes? And by the time the Arabs conquer Israel in around 639, it seems to have completed the disruption of this industry. So you think it's becoming more and more restricted of who can have it. Therefore, the market is becoming narrower and narrower. The number of tradespeople who are able to make this particular blend of blue is becoming narrower and narrower and under more and more government lockdown and regulation, and certainly not supposed to be sharing how this is made to other people. You have one good catastrophe a la invasion, and you're done. You've lost an industry. This is how secrets are lost. And we know that secrets of the ancient world were lost routinely. We only recently in the 20th century discovered how to make underwater concrete, which anybody here who's been to Caesarea will know the Romans were making very, very well. So for 2,000 years, we did not know how to pour concrete underwater. The Romans did, but they didn't share well enough. So by the time we got to the modern world, we didn't know how to do this anymore. So the idea that our ancestors and the ancients would know how to do something that we have forgotten should not come as a total surprise.
So this idea that I grew up with, to paraphrase what Harriet was saying, about the snail not being around anymore, being lost, and that's why we don't have techelet anymore. That was just for children?
Snail? Who mentioned a snail?
Nobody. This is what I'm asking.
Right. So we're going to get to the snail in 2 seconds.
Okay.
We're going to get to the snail in 2 seconds. But the idea that the snail was missing is not true. The idea that the snail wasn't identified, that was the real issue, right? So what happens is there's a snail that's mentioned in the Talmud, which, spoiler alert, we're going to be reading this in 2 paragraphs, called the chilazon. And this is this is the snail that is assumed by the Talmud to be the source of techelet, to make this color. So Marion, you asked, where did the dyes come from? In this particular case, the Talmud is going to tell us the dye for techelet, which Rambam, remember, said has to be from this source, came from a particular species of snail from the Mediterranean. How you get it from the snail is the question, and which snail is the question. And so that's what we need to tease out here. Okay? Okay.
Rabbah said, why did the divine law mention the exodus from Egypt in connection with interest, fringes, and weights?
All right, so obviously we talk about the exodus from Egypt a lot, but for certain mitzvot, it seems almost as God goes out of his way to say, and don't forget Egypt, right? Or don't forget that I took you out of Egypt when talking about certain commandments. And in particular, these three, the fringes, the fringes meaning the tzitzit, charging of interest or not charging, which we talked about last week, and having honest weights. These three get a mention. Why would that be? Well, Rabbah has an explanation.
The Holy One, blessed be he, declared, it is I who distinguished in Egypt between the drop which produced a firstborn and the drop which produced one who was not a firstborn. Even so, it is I who will exact vengeance from him who ascribes his money to a Gentile and lends it to an Israelite on interest, or who steeps his weights in salt, or who attaches to his garment threads dyed with kala ilan and maintains that it is techelet.
All right, so kala ilan is an herbal form of blue. It's a plant form that will create a blue dye, which apparently is indistinguishable from techelet. That is to say, it gives you a perfect blue as well. What in the world is Rabbah saying? Why would God be mentioning all of this and mentioning Egypt? What do these three things have in common?
They're equally important.
Well, mitzvot are mitzvot. They're all important. They're definitely important.
Yeah, definitely important.
And there's something that you can't tell the difference of just by looking. Right? That you don't know which one is which. If I held up the kala ilan dye and I held up techelet over here, you couldn't tell the difference. But God can. Right? God could tell the difference between the firstborn and the non-firstborn in Egypt. Right? We can't tell the difference. Right? I look around this room. Can I tell who's a firstborn around this table?
He can even tell the difference of the first drop that creates it, the sperm, the egg.
Exactly right.
Those drops, he even knows the difference.
Exactly. God can tell exactly what everything is everywhere. We can't. If I've got a sack of money that I say belongs to Mr. Smith, and in fact, I am Mr. Cohen, and I gave it to Mr. Smith, and he gave it back to me so that I could then lend it to you, Mr. Levi, on interest, do you know? Can you tell that which money is which? Can you look at the coin and know who truly owns it and who's cheating you or not? If you look at a weight that's been soaked in salt to make it heavier and therefore unfair, can you just look at the weight and know? Do you know that it's just a few extra grams off, but over the life of a merchant, that's going to make him quite a considerable difference? You don't know, but God does. And so the difference between the blue is something that you can't just see. And that was a big issue. Because what do you do with counterfeit then? What do you do with techelet if you don't know that it's actually techelet? Because we know that you can make the same exact color from a different plant, or from a plant rather than from the snail. And if we know the snail is more expensive, then there's a definite motivation for using the knockoff. But if we know you can only do the mitzvah with the correct one, there's a definite motivation for being sure. See the tension? Okay. So how do we handle this?
Said Abaya to Rav Samuel bar Rav Judah, as to the blue thread, how do you dye it? He said to him, we bring the blood of the hilazon.
Which the Tosafot, by the way, point out that it's not the blood meaning the lifeblood, but it's the blood meaning the secretion that comes from this animal.
Along with other ingredients, and put them together in a pot and boil them. Then we take a little out in an eggshell and test it on a piece of wool, and throw away what remains in the eggshell, and we burn the wool.
Okay, so you get your little pot, you put the blood in, there's some other things that go into it that were used for making the dye more steadfast, you boil it up, And you don't just take your tuft of wool and dip it in the pot and pull it out. You scoop out a little bit from the pot of this bubbling dye, test your wool in it, throw away what was your test batch, the little eggshell version, and burn up the wool tuft that had been dyed with the color. What are we learning and why?
3 rules are to be inferred from that statement. Dye that is used for testing is invalid.
Right, meaning the dye that you scooped out the test with, you can't just pour it back in. Once it's been scooped out to be tested with, it is now null and void.
The dye must be for the carrying out of the mitzvah. The dye used for testing renders the rest of the dye of that batch unfit.
Which the Talmud in more detail goes into, is basically saying that this is, that intention matters. Exactly, that the real issue here is that this has to be done l'shem mitzvah, for the purpose of the mitzvah of doing techelet. That if you were just bubbling up the dye and testing it on some random piece, then you would be invalidating the dye, because apparently you weren't making it for the mitzvah. So if you take out a little sample and you test it, both the testing sample as well as the tested wool can't be then turned around and used for the mitzvah, because you weren't doing this for the mitzvah, you were doing this to test that batch of dye. Right, so you have to be doing it with just the right intention, as Rav Ashi tries to explain.
And said Rav Ashi, what is the reason that the dye that is used for testing is invalid? It is because the dyeing must be for the purpose of carrying out the mitzvah.
Not for the purpose of testing the batch of dye. Right? If you're doing it for the wrong purpose, then it's no longer the right thing. By the way, for those of you that would like to hear more about this, as Judy can testify, the Mishnah class that we've been doing on Pesachim has been going an awful lot into the theme of what exactly do you mean when you do different sacrifices, different animals that you brought, and the intentionality of the person. It's a big deal throughout all of Jewish law. This is just a small sample of it.
Our rabbis have taught on Tanaite authority, the blue dye is not subject to testing, and it may be purchased only from an expert.
All right, now that "and" maybe I would have translated it as "therefore," meaning because you can't test the dye to see whether it's from the snail, the chilazon, or whether it's from the herb, you can only buy this from an expert, from somebody that you implicitly trust is giving you the correct version. The guy in the market who goes, "Psst, buddy, you want to buy some techelet?" You don't buy from him, because there's no way to know if what he's selling you is actually techelet. And as we already saw, doing the mitzvah with the wrong dye completely negates the mitzvah. Okay.
How does that translate into today and halacha?
Okay, we're getting there. You guys are just right on pace today. Everybody is asking the questions that are the next paragraph or next 2 paragraphs. Okay, so what does that mean for now? We don't actually have techelet these days. So how do we do the mitzvah of talit? Remember, a talit is the carrier of the mitzvah. The garment isn't the actual mitzvah. It's the attaching the fringes to the garment that is the mitzvah. Okay, so how do we do this mitzvah these days?
The threads of the tzitzit must be spun for the sake of the mitzvah.
Which, by the way, is why you can't just go down to Joann's and buy thread if you want to put tzitzit onto a homemade talit. Right now, we're doing a talit project with our kids. If you'd like to come and help sew, February 21st and 28th. We're doing a talit project with our kids, and they were able to go out, buy their fabric. We're going to sew it all up for them and all of that. But the tzitzit, they can't just buy at Joann's. The tzitzit I had to order in order that we have tzitzit that were made l'shem mitzvah, for the purpose of the mitzvah. That's the one piece you can't just home do unless you know how to spin wool yourself, which I don't know anyone around the room. Any wool spinners here? Rhea, you can spin wool.
When you buy a talit in Israel, for example, which is where we bought all of the families.
Excellent, right?
Are the tzitzit that they have on them?
Yes.
The right tzitzit?
Correct, yes. The tzitzit for the talitot that are sold in Israel, there is an implicit trust that they are being sold for the purpose of the mitzvah and not just as some decorative thing. and therefore that both it was spun as well as attached for the purpose of the mitzvah. So yes, you're fine. Okay, and then Ramah goes ahead and adds.
Some maintain that even the combing of the wool must be done for the sake of the mitzvah, but the custom is to be lenient about the matter.
All right, so back in Poland, he was saying, there are some that actually say that even when you're pulling the comb through the wool to straighten all the bits before you begin the spinning process, even that combing can only be for the mitzvah. You can't just comb a batch of wool and then separate out what you're going to spin for the tzitzit. And he says, but we don't really worry about that. Right. He wanted you to know that some people do, but we don't. Onward.
There are some who maintain that the tzitzit must be the same color as the tallis, and those who are particular follow this practice. All
right, so notice for example here, and this is something that you do not see almost at all within the United States, but in the Sephardic world, which Rabbi Joseph Karo was part of, this was the halacha in his day, which was that your talit and the fringes hanging off would be the same color. Not the blue one, right? Not the techelet one, but the other fringes that are hanging down, that they would be from the exact same color, because it would be the same garment that way. It would be one piece in a manner of speaking. And therefore, the fringes would be part of the garment rather than a separate color. However, for those of us in
Ashkenazim use white tzitzit even on colored garments, and one should not deviate from this practice.
We have this tradition, and indeed this seems to be the almost global tradition now that for the last 400 or 500 years, it's sort of taken over almost universally, that white, no matter what color your talit is. Make sense? Okay, but we're still left with no blue.
This mitzvah contains two commands: to make a tassel on the fringe and to wind a string of techelet around the tassel.
Right, and notice the proof text that Rambam is bringing.
Numbers states, make tassels and place on the tzitzit of the corner a string of techelet.
So notice what Rambam is doing here. Well, Rambam, based of course on the Talmud, is trying to say about the mitzvah. He's saying that paragraph that we read every single day that talks about making tzitzit and wearing techelet, there's an and in that sentence. That you should make tzitzit, you should make fringes, and you should then take and put a thread of blue, a string of blue through those fringes. That's two mitzvahs. Make fringes and put blue in the fringes. Right now, we can only do one. Right now, we can't do the blue. Right? We can only do the one. Everyone understanding what's going on there? Right? Maybe? So that's why, Howie, to go back to your question of why have we been okay with not having techelet for 1,000 years or more? And the answer is because we can still do the mitzvah of tzitzit without techelet in it. And we're still getting credit for that mitzvah. And indeed, Rambam goes into more detail and he says, this is a mitzvah that's made up of two mitzvot, but still only counts as one mitzvah. So we're not even missing the mitzvah of techelet. We just don't get the double bonus version of having techelet plus the tzitzit. And so therefore, our white-only tzitzit are perfectly fine. Or are they?
Oh.
This is techelet. You can go ahead and pass that around. These are strands of blue. What's that? Why is only one part blue? That's according to Rambam's interpretation of how this is meant to work. That you would only dye 1/2 of the winding string blue. There are other interpretations of exactly what you do with the thread of blue. And indeed, the version of the tying that we currently use on our talitot doesn't work so well when you have a thread of blue. There are many other versions of sage that the sages have explained of how it should be tied if you had the blue thread to tie with. And Rambam's goes with the idea that you only have half the thread in blue, and that's the part you use for the winding. Okay.
So it's continuous. Thread.
It's one thread. Yeah. It's just dyed halfway down. No one's going to ask me the obvious question. Where did I get it, and how do I know it's techelet?
Yeah.
All right, so Assuming I got it in Israel. Excellent, although you can get it online now. So there is an organization that's been working on this. For about the last 150 years, different authorities have been trying to unravel the mystery of Techelet. Now that we are in the modern world, and we have many more tools at our disposal to uncover what Techelet is. And thanks to both archaeology, which has shown huge pits of a particular type of snail, the Urnix trunculus. That's my best Latin I can do. Snail along the coast of the Mediterranean in many places that were clearly drilled out right where the dye sac is contained. And thanks to the experimentation of many intrepid researchers, we can now say that we have a substance which produces this color dye that matches the criteria that our ancestors had for what Techelet was. Because it is chemically identical. That is to say, the dye, once it's created, is a chemically identical, down to the molecules, blue dye that matches that blue herbal dye that we were talking about before. So it is literally indistinguishable. There is no test that can tell you this one is from the plant and this one is from the snail. The snail will produce exactly this color. Now, the question that you had about did they lie to us about the snail is you don't get this color out of the Murnix snail easily. And in fact, when you get the dye out of it, it's kind of this weird yellowy, sickly color. Yeah, it's, you know, it's ancient industry. We just have to deal with the yuckiness. And if you dip a piece of wool into that and pull it out, it'll be purple. A beautiful purple, and it's the exact purple that goes along with the prohibitions by the emperors of Rome. And we can begin to understand why purple and blue were mentioned together as being an industry, because what was discovered in the 1980s by this research group was that you can change it from purple to blue if during the dyeing process, at a certain point, you expose it to UV light, sunlight. If you take the vat of the dye and you go out into sunlight and you dip your white wool in and pull it out, you get blue. If you take it into the shadow and you dump it in and pull it out, you get purple, right? Under the sky, you get blue. I mean, it really is quite miraculous, and I've seen it firsthand. When I was there as a rabbinic student, we visited the factory, the small cottage industry where they are making this. And they demonstrated it for us with our, so we could see it with our own eyes in a little glass beaker. You could just watch the transformation happen. And the yellow slime turned into this beautiful blue. It was quite incredible to watch. So now the question becomes.
That's what Rambam meant when we talked about the sun.
And maybe that's what he meant about the sun being in a certain part of the sky. As being what it was. Although, as near as we can tell, by the time Rambam came along, this industry for creating the blue had passed on. So he may have had the tradition about something that had to do with sunlight, but wasn't able to translate that into an actual creation of that same dye. I saw more hands. Yeah.
So in today's world, we can go online.
Yep.
Or order from, well, when we're in Israel.
Techelet.com.
What happens in countries that aren't as advanced? How do they get the?
Well, more than that. Why aren't we? Okay, so how would they get? And indeed, that was the main problem with Techelet for most of the late antiquity, which was Techelet existed. But between imperial edicts and the general cost of this dye, most Jews couldn't afford Techelet. And eventually they stopped wearing Techelet because you couldn't afford it. It'd be like trying to say everyone can only come to shul if they're driving a BMW. After a while, that's not working for a lot of people anymore. And you're going to say, okay, just come with whatever car you want and we're okay. And now, okay, everyone's fine. But after a while, you might stop making BMWs. And then the question becomes, when someone reopens the BMW factory, and now that we can all afford them, imagine, Do we all have to drive one?
You reminded me of a question I had when we looked at Menachot 42b at the top of the page. The last sentence in that part, the blue dye is not subject to testing and it may be purchased only from an expert. We had said that that was to maintain its purity, its yichus.
Right, exactly.
But might it also not have just been a reflection of economic reality? It was such an expensive and made rare because of its expense, that saying this just made it a little bit easier to deal with.
It made it a little bit easier, but it also, like you say, recognized the reality that because it was so expensive, the knockoff dye made from the plant was so much more tempting.
Yes.
And if you wanted to fulfill the mitzvah, you would be tempted to buy it from a less reputable dealer and risk that maybe he was using the plant dye rather than the snail dye. And they're basically saying, don't go down that road.
No, because God will know the difference.
Exactly right, which is why we had that earlier text.
Right.
So you have to have the right dye, and you have to be sure it's the right dye. And there's no way for you to be sure it's the right dye unless you know it's being made from the right substance. And the only way for that to happen is to go to the people who are responsible for doing this, but that becomes prohibitively difficult and expensive. And so for more than 1,000 years, we stop. And in the process of stopping, we lose the technology. But now, every criteria that the Talmud lays out for what the chilazon, that particular snail is, and what the dye should look like, we seem to be meeting down the checklist. And I do encourage you to go to the Techelet site. They have a much more in-depth discussion about this particular issue. So the question is, do we have to? And can we? Because those are two different questions, right? Of do we have to go and buy these and now put them in because we can and because they're relatively inexpensive? If I remember correctly, and it was a little while ago, the set of tzitzit cost me, I believe, about $50, which is not chump change, but it's also not the price of a BMW, and it's not something that only emperors and government officials can afford. So that certainly puts it within the once in your life or twice in your life, depending upon how many talits you have, affordability. A pair of tefillin cost a lot more than that. So we're used to having mitzvahs that cost us a little bit of economic inconvenience, and $50, even $100 is not a huge investment for something that you're going to be wearing daily. So do we have to, and should we? All right, so let's listen to somebody who says, don't do it, because it's always good. So this is from Rav Shlomo Avner, who is a rabbi in Israel, who is not exactly the most strict, but also not the most lenient. So he posts on the internet, so that alone puts him in a certain category. But he does give a very cogent defense of the traditionalist point of view, which is don't do it.
It is forbidden to act with yuchara, that is religious haughtiness, before the great rabbis of our generation. It is haughty to act strictly in front of one's rabbi. If someone wears techelet, we do not disparage him. He has on whom to rely.
That means to say there are some opinions that sort of say this is kind of maybe okay. So if he's wearing them, we're not going to walk up to him and slap him. But
if someone comes and asks,
which they should,
we say to him, do not display yuchara.
Right? Don't be haughty. Don't show yourself to be so religiously superior by taking on a stringency that the other great rabbis of the day are not doing. And so, well, he'll explain.
The Torah scholars of our generation wore and wear white tzitzit, and we are going to act strictly in front of them? Do we know more about Techelet than Harav Avraham Shapira of blessed memory? Do we know more about Techelet than Harav Mordechai Eliyahu Shilt?
Shlita means he's still alive.
Oh, he's still alive.
Right.
Oh, Shlita. Oh, that's... In sum, we need to continue to research the matter, and it is a long journey. Although the heart aches, we wait. In the meanwhile, we wear white. It has completely turned white, it is pure, which is a play on Vayikra.
Okay. So what's his opinion?
No
You
blue.
can, but if you ask, which you always should do before doing anything different than other people around you, don't. Why not?
Oh,
It's arrogant,
exactly.
right? I mean, it's like trying to show off.
Is this like kosher versus black kosher?
Oh,
Well, one might argue that that
What's black kosher?
there are plenty of other activities that are well above and beyond and beyond and beyond what the mitzvah itself is, or even what the regular people were doing at a certain time. What's the difference here? Is don't go past your rabbi. It's not don't continue to be stricter. It's don't be stricter than him. And in his community, I can use him with unreservedly. That it's doing more than your rabbi is doing that is considered prideful and arrogant and haughty. And therefore, if one of the great rabbis within these communities starts doing it, then you have permission to do it. But until they do, sit and wait. Even though the evidence seems to be overwhelming by every possible measure that we have it, who are you to start it? Who are you to do it first? Wait for one of the greats to move and then you can follow. Anything less just seems stuck up. Make sense? Maybe? Well, if you think that's a really good explanation, let's read a little bit from Shulchan Aruch.
Women and slaves are exempt from tzitzit, since it is a positive time-bound mitzvah. Nevertheless, if they choose to wrap themselves and recite the bracha, they are permitted to do so.
A good reminder.
But it bespeaks of haughtiness. Therefore, they should not wear tzitzit, since it is not an obligation incumbent upon a person, meaning one is not obligated to purchase a four-cornered garment to become obligated in the mitzvah.
All right, let me take that last part first. What it means for a mitzvah to not be incumbent upon a person, but incumbent upon a thing. Right? There are certain mitzvot that you have to do by virtue of being alive. Right? You're alive, you have to say a blessing before you eat. It's done. But the mitzvah of tzitzit is a mitzvah that only kicks into effect when you own a certain shaped garment, four-cornered. And what he's saying here is that since you have to actively purchase a four-cornered garment, you're not born with one, then to deliberately go out and buy a garment that will then need to have tzitzit, if you're a woman, shows that you are being haughty in pursuing the opportunity to do this. And yes, you could do it, and it would be permitted, but the only people who would do that would be people who were showing off. Therefore, it's better not to do it.
And what year was this?
And what year was this?
Yeah.
The 1500s. Okay. But that is exactly the same argument that is currently being used against allowing women of the wall to wear a talit, wear tefillin, and read from the Torah at the kotel in the women-only section with only women. And like I said last Saturday, we had a much longer discussion about the recent government decision, but just within that narrow part, that Shulchan Aruch is very clear. For women among women to wear a talit, to wear tefillin, to read from the Torah, everybody agrees it's permitted. But the argument against it is the same argument that the Ramah uses here, which is, yeah, but the only people who would do it are arrogant, and therefore I can prohibit it because of the arrogance, not because of the innate problem. And that's the same argument, as you can see, that's used by many people with regarding techelet. Don't wear techelet because it looks ostentatious. Women don't wear talit because it looks ostentatious.
I guess I look at it a little differently in that the previous example, the rabbi was saying, it's fine to do it, just wait for the scholars to take that first step. Don't do it before they do. So wait for it to be well thought out and looked at through the eyes of the sages and through history and tradition. And then if you find a rabbi that says, okay, this makes sense, then go ahead and follow that rabbi, and it's perfectly fine.
But the rabbis who are in control of the hotel would not accept the fact that a female might be considered a scholar.
Okay.
Well, what she's trying to say, I believe, is that for both the issue of techelet as well as the issue of women wearing a talit or other types of things that are rejected out of being pretentious, is that there is a self-reinforcing cycle, which is to say the people who are in charge get to decide what is pretentious, and pretentious means doing things they're not doing. Therefore, you are always inherently limited to only doing what they do. And why would they change?
Because people change over time. The rabbis change over time. The issue is the amount of time it takes to get to where you want to go. And you can do it today and say, forget about tradition, let's just do it. Or you can take the long approach, which is, let's do the analysis, let's do the circumspection, let's take years to get to where we want to be and not say it's got to be done today or else I'm walking away.
And with regards to techelet, in the meantime, the opportunity for the mitzvah passes.
Right.
I mean, that's the tension, right?
Absolutely.
Well, that's a pretty big downside to say, we're going to
My life.
hold off on doing the mitzvah,
Right.
because although all the objective evidence says that this is the right way to do it, the rabbinic stamp of approval hasn't been received yet, although there's no additional evidence that is being waited for. The issue with regards to wearing a talit, I can understand the implications for some communities of why they feel that might be disruptive to their community. But it is hard to imagine how offensive a strand of blue could be, that given that the factual information has been gathered, collated, and shown to meet every criteria the Talmud lays out for why this is exactly the source and version of the dye that has been looked for, it's hard to see exactly what additional information or reasoning is being considered before the next step, other than this is the way we've been doing it, and therefore we're not going to do it differently. And that is an argument that is not subject to reason or review, because in fact, every year that it's delayed becomes another year that we've always done it this way.
I think there's a difference between the tradition of we've always done it this way and the definition of what is haughty.
Oh.
And I guess my issue with all of this is not what you've been discussing, but my issue is against this definition of what is haughty, particularly today. That's it.
Because what's wrong with this definition, in your opinion?
For today, a person who wants to express her Judaism in the only way expression was described traditionally today should be at least tolerated, if not celebrated, but at least tolerated separately. I appreciate the argument, we've always done it this way, and there should be room for that as well. But to say that doing otherwise is haughty, it might be against the way you've been doing it all these years. I just don't think that the word haughty is right.
And indeed, one of the interesting issues, and I definitely recommend, if you go to Rav Shlomo Avener's site, you'll see more information on this. I had to condense what I could to fit on the page. He brings examples of people who deviate from the norm in a way that might be considered haughty that are praised. And for them, it's acceptable because we know they're doing it for the right reason, and therefore it's not haughty. And that, I think, is underlying your point, is that if haughtiness is an objective, you go past a certain line and it's considered haughty, maybe we can understand that. But if haughtiness is subjective, meaning if you go past a line that I don't approve of you going past, but I would approve of him or her going past. That becomes much harder for us to say, how do we work with this? How do we function with an ever ambiguous line of what is and is not permitted based upon another person's assessment of what's in my heart, of why I'm doing this. And I think that it is a very good thing for each of us to ask is, if I got the techelet and I was wearing it, would I be wearing it to show off to my friends that, look, I've got techelet and look at how pious and wonderful I am? Or would we be celebrating that we live in an age of miracles, that we have rediscovered something that was lost for 1,300 years at least, if not more, and that allows us to perform a mitzvah that for the last 1,300 years was denied to our ancestors, the same way that the mitzvot of going to Eretz Israel are allowed to us, but were denied to so many of our ancestors. That self-review of why am I doing this, I think is a very good thing. The external review, I object to. That is to say, for someone else to say, I know why you're doing it, and it's not for the reason you think you are. That's problematic to me.
Exactly.
But the self-reflection, I agree. Yes, we do need to say, am I wearing this because I want to be the only guy in the room with blue? Am I wearing this because I want to show off? And certainly if this was even more expensive, if this was $5,000 worth of dye, then I might even be flashing my materialism about how much I can afford. But if I'm doing it for the right reasons, which I know in my heart and won't be hanging off a little explanation note on my tzitzit, then by all means, there's another mitzvah to do.
And that's problematic too, because the right reasons, the quote, right reasons, unquote, are also subjective.
Absolutely.
To an extent.
Which goes back to our text from Menachot again, that says when you make the tzitzit in the first place, they have to be made for the mitzvah. And there is a great deal of latitude for exactly what that means. Does it mean that when you're making the mitzvah, making the tzitzit for the mitzvah, but you plan to sell them, is that really the mitzvah? Or are you really making them so you can sell them? Or do you have to spin it yourself? I mean, we already saw the leniency from Shulchan Aruch, which is one of the reasons I brought it, that there were some that said you had to even comb the wool for the mitzvah, but we're not strict about that. So how far you chase down intention, how far you force intention to be made somehow explicit and subject to external examination is always a big question in Judaism, because intention does matter. But ultimately, intention is what matters. And for many things, we do have the opportunity to allow our intention to support what we are doing. All right. Best of intentions.
The last paragraph?
Oh, sorry. Thank you. The last paragraph was Rambam on the same topic as Shulchan Aruch, just to show a contrast with what Ramah said.
Women and servants who wish to wrap themselves in tzitzit may do so without reciting a blessing.
Because they're not commanded to, therefore they don't say the blessing, but they can still do it.
Similarly, regarding the other positive commandments which women are not required to fulfill, if they desire to fulfill them without reciting a blessing, they should not be prevented from doing so.
Rambam, short and sweet, as is his usual way, except when doing philosophy.
Why should they do a blessing
So-
if they want to do a blessing?
So the issue with the blessing, which is more involved in the modern day, where women are feeling more and more obligated and accepting, but in his day, where women were definitely not considered to be obligated to the commandments, these commandments, these in particular, to say a blessing where you invoke God's name, where you say, I was commanded, we were commanded, when you were not part of the object of the command, would be an inappropriate use of God's name. That was what Rambam was responding to in that case. I personally do agree that, yes, if a woman is willing to embrace and say, I am equally commanded as a man next to me, and therefore I will not shirk. I'm not wearing the talit because it looks good with my hat. I'm not wearing the talit because it keeps me warm with the air conditioning too high in the room.
I'm not wearing it because I am a woman and women have the right to wear it.
Right, I'm wearing
That's
it.
another.
Right, I'm not wearing it to show my feminist credentials,
There you go.
to use a shorthand. And again, nothing against feminism, but the talit is not a symbol of feminism. The talit is a symbol of the commandments. And if you are wearing it to show your connectivity to the commandments, then by all means, say a blessing. But Only you really know why you put it on.
Intention.
So yes, thank you for that follow-up.